All right, let's dive into what is no joke, one of the biggest detective stories in the history of public health. It's this incredible story about what was once seen as a miracle cure that, well, turned into a global killer. We're going to follow the decades long scientific hunt to finally prove, beyond all doubt, that smoking causes cancer.
In a lot of ways, our story really ends right here in 1964. You have to understand, this wasn't just another report. This was a verdict. After decades of debate, of mounting evidence, and some pretty fierce resistance, the scientific community basically drew a line in the sand. This relationship, it was now fact. There was simply no more room for doubt.
I know, right? It's so hard to imagine a time when this wasn't just common sense. But, getting to this point of certainty, it was an absolute epic struggle against centuries of medical tradition, huge industrial power, and the very limits of science itself. So, how did they actually prove it? To really get what happened, we've got to go back. Way back. Back to a time when tobacco wasn't seen as a poison, but as a cure-all. A time when the whole framework of medicine was just completely different from what we know today. Okay, so for centuries, European medicine was completely dominated by this one big idea, humoral theory. The thinking was that your health depended entirely on the balance of four fluids in your body. You had blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. So every single illness, from a little cough to the plague, was just seen as an imbalance, a sign your humors were all out of whack. And the goal of any treatment? Simple. Restore that balance. And right into this world comes tobacco, a powerful new plant from the Americas. And doctors thought it was a miracle drug, a potent new tool to rebalance those humors. So it was prescribed for pretty much everything, from treating tumors to preventing the plague. And yeah, that last point on the slide, that is not a typo. Tobacco smoke enemas were a real accepted medical procedure used to try and revive drowning victims they'd pulled from the River Thames. Wild, right? So you can see this incredibly slow shift happening over centuries. For the longest time, tobacco was medicine, period. But then, in the late 1700s, you start to get these crucial turning points. A doctor, Percival Pott, makes this kind of radical discovery that soot, something from the environment, was causing cancer in chimney sweeps. And for the very first time, this idea that something outside the body could cause a disease inside it starts to take hold. By the 1800s, a few sharp-eyed doctors were noticing a pattern. Hey, we're seeing more cancers of the mouth and nose among smokers. The first little red flags were finally going up. But these were still just scattered observations. It turns out, two major developments in the 19th century were about to take this niche habit and turn it into a global epidemic. And in doing so, they were going to create a public health crisis on a scale nobody had ever seen before. So the first big change was actually biological. The tobacco that was native to North America, Nicotina rustica, was incredibly harsh. We're talking around 9% nicotine. You just couldn't inhale its smoke. But then, farmers started cultivating a different species, Nicotina tabacum. It was way milder, only about 1% nicotine. And this, right here, was the game changer. The smoke was now smooth enough to be inhaled, delivering its contents directly and deeply into the lungs for the first time on a massive scale. And the second change, that was industrial. Before 1880, cigarettes were a luxury. They had to be rolled by hand. But then this guy, James Bonsack, invents a machine that could just churn out 200 cigarettes a minute. Suddenly, cigarettes were cheap, they were everywhere, and they were super easy to smoke. The stage was officially set. And the consequences of these two shifts were just staggering. In the UK, just between 1922 and 1947, deaths from lung cancer increased 15-fold. 15! A similar explosion was happening in the US and other places. A disease that was once pretty rare was becoming a common killer. This wasn't just a trend, it was a full-blown epidemic in the making. So this is where the real detective work begins. The old medical theories? Totally useless. Even the dominant germ theory of disease, which was brilliant for fighting infections, it just couldn't explain a chronic disease like cancer. Scientists needed a whole new approach, a brand new set of tools to investigate this mystery. The main tool they developed was something called the case control study. It's actually a pretty simple but really powerful idea. You take a group of people who have lung cancer, those are your cases, and you compare them to a really similar group of people who don't have lung cancer, those are your controls. And then you look backwards. You ask what's different about their lives, their habits, their jobs. You're basically hunting for clues in their past. And using this new tool, well,
The clues just started piling up from all over the world. Early studies in the 20s and 30s kept finding the exact same thing. Heavy smokers were way more likely to have lung cancer. Down in Argentina, a scientist named Angel Raffo actually painted tobacco tar on rabbits' ears, and he proved that it was the tar itself, not the nicotine, that was causing tumors. The evidence was still scattered, for sure, but it was all pointing in the same direction. All these studies were important pieces of the puzzle, but they were scattered. The world needed a definitive moment, a point where the evidence became so overwhelming that it just couldn't be ignored anymore. And that moment, it came in the year 1950. And then came 1950. In a single year, 4 massive, really high-quality studies all get published in the world's top medical journals. And they all arrived at the same terrifying conclusion. In the US, Winder and Graham found that over 96% of their lung cancer patients were heavy smokers. And in the UK, Richard Dahl and Austin Bradford Hill published a landmark paper showing this uniquely strong and specific link. You put them all together, and it was an absolute academic bombshell. And here's the critical part. All of these studies found what's called a dose-response effect. This was key. It wasn't just that smokers got cancer more often. It was that the more they smoked, the higher their risk became. Light smokers had a lower risk. Chain smokers had the highest risk of all. This kind of gradient is one of the strongest pieces of evidence you can find that one thing is actually causing another. Okay, so with this mountain of evidence from 1950, you'd think that would be the end of it, right? Case closed. But it wasn't. The world just kept right on smoking. Why? Well, the problem was the public was getting some incredibly mixed messages. I mean, you had doctors, actual doctors, appearing in cigarette ads. And in response to all the scary headlines, the tobacco industry didn't admit anything. They just marketed solutions. They introduced filters and milder cigarettes, creating this illusion of a safer choice. And to be fair, there was a valid scientific criticism. All these studies looked backwards. They were retrospective. So people could ask, what if there was something else that smokers did that also caused cancer? The evidence was strong, but it wasn't quite bulletproof yet. To deliver that final, irrefutable proof, scientists knew they needed to flip the script. Instead of looking backward at people who were already sick, they needed to look forward. They had to design a study so massive, so rigorous, that its conclusions would be absolutely undeniable. And this led to what is arguably one of the most important medical studies of the entire 20th century. In 1951, Dahl and Hill launched the British Doctors Study. The design was just brilliantly simple. Instead of looking backward at sick people, they looked forward. They surveyed tens of thousands of British doctors, a group with pretty similar lifestyles, right? About their smoking habits. And then they just waited. They followed this huge group for years and then for decades, just tracking who died and what they died of. So after 10 years, the results were in, and they were breathtaking. The lung cancer death rate for every 1,000 non-smoking doctors was just 0.07, a tiny number. For the heaviest smokers, it was 3.15. The numbers were just so stark, so clear, you couldn't argue with them. And because they had tracked the group from the very beginning, they proved definitively that smoking came first and the cancer came later. This, right here, was the smoking gun. And it was this undeniable forward-looking evidence from the British Doctors Study, plus a similar massive study in the US, that really formed the backbone of the 1964 Surgeon General's report. This is what finally allowed for that definitive statement we started with. The scientific case was officially closed. The hunt was over. And that kind of brings us to a final thought. This whole journey, from celebrated medicine to confirmed carcinogen, it took centuries. And even after that scientific bombshell in 1950, it took another 14 years for that knowledge to become official public policy. It really makes you wonder, what widely held beliefs do we have today? What things that seem perfectly normal and safe to us might be viewed by future generations with the same kind of disbelief we feel when we see an old ad of a doctor endorsing a cigarette?